Chapter 24. Everything Goes Wrong. Fog lay heavy in the vineyard as Henry walked under the waxing moon. He touched the dead vines as he went, and his feet made roiling eddies in the mist with every step. The night was cold. "Your message was highly unusual, Henry." A large black wolf appeared beside him, matching his stride. Henry kept walking straight ahead. "I knew you'd come," he said calmly. The wolf transformed into Strahd, his shoulders level with Henry's. The Count continued walking, never casting Henry a glance. "Give me one good reason why I should not kill you now." Henry clenched his jaw. "I've spoken with Irina," he said. "I think I can convince her to marry you, but it will take time. I need a month. At the end of that month, you can propose to her, and she will say yes." "That's quite a proposition. And if she says no?" "Then you can do what you want with me. Kill me." "A month is a long time, considering all the trouble you and your friends have already been about. What more havoc will you wreak if I let you run amok in my county for another month?" Henry took a deep breath. "I have only ever meant to help this valley and fulfill my duty as sheriff. Tomorrow we're going to Yester Hill to settle a dispute between the mountain folk and the Martikovs." Strahd stopped in his tracks. Henry did the same. "I agree," Strahd said with a leery tone. "But you will have only a 10-day. If Irina says yes on the 10th day, your life is spared." "Agreed," Henry said. He looked Strahd in the eyes. A hint of a smile flickered across the vampire's lips as he transformed into a cloud of mist and faded into the surrounding fog. "Are we ready for this?" Irina asked. They stood on the edge of the woods, looking up at Yester Hill. The massive escarpment towered at least 400 feet above the surrounding forest, and extended more than a quarter-mile from end to end. Its rocky slopes were dotted with scores of piled cairns, and crisscrossed by well-worn footpaths. On the south end of the hill's grassy dome, they could discern a copse of trees through the mist. Among them stood one huge, misshapen tree with grasping branches. At the very peak, Yester Hill was crowned by a ring of boulders. These were not like the standing menhirs at Berez or the windmill. Instead, they were arranged more like the crumbling remains of an ancient cyclopean wall, with two openings on the north and south sides. Regardless, Navarra was convinced that this ring of stones, or perhaps the entire hill, was the last fane. "I don't think we'll ever be completely ready," Rowan said, flexing a fist around her staff. "I'm ready for this," Navarra said, lifting her chin. Lightning struck the stone wall on the hilltop, its flash illuminating a giant statue that stood within the circle. The statue was hard to make out from this distance, but they trusted Elvir's report that it was an effigy of a cloaked man with fangs. "I'm not sure this plan is a good idea," Davian said, leaning on his cane. "I'm very grateful that you want to get the winery's gem back, but remember what Elvir said." "I think it's a trap," Elvir said, "just in case anyone forgot." The dirt on Elvir's clothes and bits of foliage in his greasy hair were evidence of his recent activity. He had been hiding in the woods and surveilling the mountain folk for the past few days. "They completed that statue the day before yesterday, but they've still been coming and going like they're preparing for some kind of ritual," he said, pointing up at the hill. "There must be more than a dozen warriors and druids up there, but never more than 2 or 3 show themselves at a time. Every couple hours or so, a bolt of lightning comes down and strikes one of those boulders. Then one of the druids examines the statue, as if they expect something to happen. They're guarding it, waiting for something. Maybe for you." "That's why disguising ourselves is our best option," Navarra said, lifting her hands to cast a spell. "Have we all?" Navara stopped, noticing something in the trees. Henry turned and saw a tawny owl perched on a branch. "Oh, no, you don't!" Navara shot it with an eldritch blast, and it blew apart in a puff of feathers. "What did you do that for?" Irina asked. "It was the same owl that was spying on us in Vallaki, if you remember," Navara said. She sounded proud of her accomplishment. "I think it was a spy for Strahd. I used to see it hanging around outside Vasili's apartment all the time." "Are you sure it was the same owl?" Rowan smirked. "I could recognize that bird a mile away," Navara said. "Just like you could recognize me as a cat?" Navara adjusted her shoulders and gesticulated her fingers in an arcane pattern. "You do change the shade of your fur sometimes." "No, I don't." Navara ignored the comment. "Ready, Rowan?" Rowan sighed. "Yes." Irina leaned over and whispered to Henry. "We need to tell them." Henry had hoped he could avoid this conversation until after Yester Hill, but he nodded. "Wait," he said to Navara and Rowan. "We have 10 days. 10 days to prepare before we confront Strahd." Rowan and Navara gawked at him. Henry could have told them sooner. He could have told them how he and Irina had made plans to lay a trap for Strahd at his own wedding. He could have mentioned that he had left a note in Strahd's coffin at the Tsolenka Pass, telling the vampire to meet him at midnight in the vineyard. But they did not need to know all the details right now. Right now, they needed to be focused on the mission at hand, retrieving the second gem. Instead, all he said was, "Irina and I told Strahd she would accept his proposal of marriage in 10 days. He'll leave us alone until then." Anger and confusion spread over the two elves' faces. "We think," Irina said, "if Strahd is right about breaking the curse, that if I marry him, Barovia will be freed from its curse." "We're still going to kill Strahd," Henry assured them. "But we can only do that after the curse is broken." Rowan folded her arms. "You shouldn't have been making deals with the enemy behind our backs." "I know," Irina said earnestly. She shot Henry a look. "And we promise to tell you all our plans in the future. No more secrets." 10 days, huh?" Navara said, slowly nodding. "Yeah, we can do it. We can do it. All right, let's get going. Rowan?" Rowan was staring up at Yester Hill. Her eyes and mouth gaped in shock. Navara tapped her shoulder. Rowan turned to the warlock. "I heard a voice coming from one of the cairns. Someone talking inside my head." "Vampire?" Navara asked. No, it was a different voice, but it was calling me." "Another voice?" Navara asked. "Do you want to call off the plan? We can fall back and—" "No," Rowan said. "We need to do this now." Henry cocked an eyebrow. "I don't know. Hearing voices in your head isn't a good sign, especially right before a covert operation." "I'm ready." And with that, Rowan transformed into a bat. "Ready, Henry?" Navara asked. He nodded. "Remember, you're in charge, Navara. If you think it's too dangerous at any point, make the call, and we'll all get out of there." Davian said a prayer to the Morning Lord, and Elvir wished them luck. The younger Martikov patted the wooden box on the ground, and told them he would take good care of Rowan's coffin. Henry was glad the Dampier had brought it from the winery. He wasn't sure how useful it would be, but it put Rowan at ease to have it nearby, as though she expected she was going to die. Navara told Herkomoid to stay with Elvir, then waved her fingers again in an arcane pattern, this time completing the spell. When Henry looked down at himself, he saw nothing there, and when he looked up again, Navara and Irina had also turned invisible. Navara walked up one of the dirt paths to the hilltop, with Rowan fluttering overhead. She heard Henry and Irina's footsteps behind her, and saw a raven flitting its way among the cairns. When she came near the crest of the hill, she saw a white castle off to the west, beyond the mist, maybe a mile away, and she remembered that this hill marked the farthest edge of the county. Perhaps the denizens of that castle were blissfully unaware of what torments the people of Barovia had been suffering in the Shadowfell, so close and yet so far away. But there was no time to wonder about such things now. She turned her attention to the opening in the stone wall ahead. A thin man with a braided beard was standing at the entrance, leaning against a boulder. Though he was probably supposed to be on watch, he looked bored and was whittling a stick with his battle-axe. He did not notice the invisible warlock. In the middle of the circle, there were 2 more tribesmen idly conversing. Navara could tell that one of them was a druid by the bear-claw amulet on his staff. The other carried a spear and sported blue paint on his face. The statue loomed over them, about 50 feet tall, crudely fashioned with logs, twigs, and clay. But it did look vaguely like Strahd, and a green light emanated from its brambly chest. "The gem," Navara thought. "There it is." She stepped gingerly past the whittling men and into the circle. Now she could no longer hear Irina or Henry's footsteps behind her. It was good to know they were on standby, but this part was up to her and Rowan. She had walked halfway across the grassy enclosure when the blue-painted man noticed the bat flying above her. He gave it a curious tilt of his head. Navara, still invisible, looked up at Rowan. They needed to be quick. The tribesman was just a few yards away and coming closer. Navara reached up, tapped Rowan, then moved her hands and whispered a spell. All at once, Rowan slipped into Navara's cloak, while Navara dropped her invisibility and transformed into a perfect likeness of Strahd. The transition was so smooth that anyone watching would have thought the Count himself had turned from bat to man. The painted warrior fell prostrate at her feet. "My lord," he said, his nose inches from the ground. The other 2 tribesmen, seeing Navara in disguise, also dropped to their knees and bowed low. Navara smiled, trying to put on her best impression of the vampire's cruel grin. She was pleased with the illusion, from the black hair and square jaw, to the ruby pendant at her neck, to the brass buckles on her boots. "What else do you need, my lord?" asked the druid with the bear-claw staff. What else? Navara thought. She dropped her voice as low as she could, trying to replicate Strahd's posh but masculine inflection. "I want you to tell me what you are doing here," she said, walking slowly among the prostrate men. The druid looked up at her. "My lord?" He seemed confused. "Did I stutter?" Navara glared at him. She needed to be more aggressive. "No, my lord." The man bowed his head again. "Forgive me. We are trying to follow your orders as best we can. Everything is prepared as you instructed." "Repeat to me what I told you, so I know you got it right," Navara said. "You wanted us to wait here for the knight and his companions to arrive. Then, at the signal of the wolf's howl, we attack." Navara's heart skipped a beat, and she felt the little bat squirming inside her cloak. The cringing druid's face was so low, the grass muffled his voice. "We are to capture the 2 redheads without harming them, then wait for your command." Navara looked around. There was no sign or sound of a wolf nearby. She flicked her cloak and continued to pace around the groveling men. "And what do you plan on doing with this statue?" she asked. The druid cleared his throat. "As soon as the fight begins," he said, "Winter Splinter will awaken and bring ruin to your enemies." Rowan wriggled as if she was trying to communicate a warning, but Navara ignored it and stood her ground. "And the gem?" she prodded. "The gem is Winter Splinter's heart," the druid said. "Baba Lysaga showed us how to create him with its magic." Again Navara surveyed the hilltop around her. Upon seeing no danger but the 3 obsequious tribesmen, she kicked the druid. "You! Climb up there and bring me the gem." "My lord?" the man asked. "Bring me the gem," Navara said, in as commanding a voice as she could muster. The druid looked to the others, then back at her. "Why do you need the gem?" he asked. "Shouldn't it stay where it is?" Navara grabbed the man by his collar, pulled him to his feet, and shook him. "You dare defy me!" she yelled. Her voice would be hoarse after this. "You dare to challenge my methods? If I hear one more question from your lips, I will rip out your tongue and shove it down your throat. I am your lord. I give the orders. Now get me that gem." The druid transformed into a squirrel and scurried up the statue. But just as he reached the green glow, Navara felt a strange sensation wash over her. In the blink of an eye, everything was larger. The grass came up to her nose, and the tribesmen seemed the size of giants. Rowan, no longer a bat, was now an enormous elf sprawled on the grass beside her. "Rowan, what's happening?" Navara tried to talk, but all she did was squeak. And when she attempted to walk forward, she hopped. At that moment, a wolf's howl cut through the air like a knife. Peering from behind one of the boulders of the stone wall, Henry watched as Navara turned into a rabbit and began hopping around. "What the hell is she doing?" he thought. "Henry," Irina said, "we're not invisible anymore." Navara had lost her concentration on the spell. Something was wrong. Henry pulled himself up to get a better view. Oh shit. Count Strahd, the real Count Strahd, was there. He sat astride a black charger wreathed in fire. A nightmare. The infernal stallion shook its flaming mane, and sparks flew like flint on iron when it pawed the ground with its flaming hooves. As Strahd lifted his sword, an elegant weapon with a swept hilt and a long blade, 6 wolves appeared beside him. One of them threw back its head and let out a piercing cry. At once, painted warriors began bursting forth from grave-like pits hidden all across the hilltop. They had been waiting for this signal. Then the devil and all his minions began closing in on the elf and the rabbit in the middle of the stone circle. Henry needed to save them. He stepped back behind the boulder and flicked his wrist. Snowflake appeared. "It's a trap," he said. Irina drew her sword, but Henry shook his head. He was more afraid now than he had been since entering Barovia, and his heart was beating like a drum. "No, we can't win this fight," he said. "Strahd's here. You need to get on Snowflake and run to the woods." Irina looked like she wanted to protest, but instead she mounted, gathered up the reins, and turned to Henry. "I love you," she said. "I love you too. Now go!" He slapped Snowflake's rump, and Irina tore down the hillside. Henry sprinted as fast as he could through the gap in the wall and toward his friends, but they were more than 100 feet away. He looked on, unable to do anything but run, as Navara and Rowan were beset by wolves and warriors. They surrounded Rowan, striking with spears and axes on every side. Rowan whirled her staff from one attacker to the next, desperately defending herself. Amid the onslaught, she pointed her staff at the rabbit and transformed Navara back into an elf. More mountain folk joined in the fray. Several druids among them were casting spells at the 2 elves. Thorny vines sprouted from the ground to grab at their feet, but Navara blasted them away. Henry's boots pounded the ground, tearing up grass as he ran. Seeing the charging knight, 2 of the tribesmen had turned to confront him. They stood between Henry and his companions. Instinctively, he reached for Apollo's hilt. "Let's give 'em hell, man," Apollo said in Henry's thoughts. But Henry pulled back his hand. "Fighting is no use. I can't let Strahd see you yet." Not even bothering to draw his dagger, Henry raised his shield and plowed into the men who barred his way. He bowled one of them over, and immediately spun to avoid the second man's axe. As he turned, he extended his left arm and brought the edge of his shield slamming against the man's head with a crack. The man crumpled, his skull staved in just as surely as if he had been struck by a mace. But no sooner had Henry cleared a path through these warriors than 3 more jumped forward to take their place. He seemed no closer to his friends. Through the melee, Henry could see the 2 elves standing back to back, fighting for their lives against a rising tide. Each wolf that lunged at Navara was met by a green blast in turn. She was about to cast another spell when Strahd waved his hand. Again, Navara turned into a rabbit. One of the druids grabbed her by the ears and tried to carry her off, but Rowan struck him with her staff, and he fell. Navara hopped free, and Rowan cast a spell to change her back into an elf. The warlock staggered, trying to catch her balance. She looked up to see Strahd waving his hand for a 3rd time, but now she threw back his magic with a counterspell of her own. Yelling in frustration, she flexed her fingers as if to stop an invisible ball in mid-air. This time she would not be transformed. Out of nowhere, a crossbow bolt hissed through the air and lodged itself in the gut of a huge warrior who was trying to wrest Henry's shield from his grasp. Henry, not waiting for the big man to fall, kicked him to the ground and pressed forward. From the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of a hooded figure among the boulders, and he was almost certain that the hidden archer was Davian. By now Henry had pushed his way through the ranks of wolves and warriors to within a stone's throw of Rowan and Navara. He had also caught Strahd's attention. The vampire wheeled around and spurred his mount toward Henry, raising his sword overhead. "We had a deal!" Henry shouted. Shaking the ground with its hooves, roaring like the host of hell, swallowing up the world around it with darkness and fire, the nightmare bore down on him. "We had a deal!" Henry shouted again, bashing aside another warrior with his shield as he braced for Strahd's charge. He would have to be quick or be trampled. A moment before the stallion was upon him, Strahd replied, "There are no deals between gods and men." Then all at once the vampire's sword came down in a great arc, while Henry jumped back and raised his shield. Time seemed to slow around him as Henry realized, too late, that the blow was a feint. Instead of striking his shield, Strahd's blade swept around underhanded, slicing deep into the back of Henry's leg. Henry stumbled forward, unable to hold his weight, but his wings opened to catch his fall, and he regained his balance. Henry looked up to see Strahd galloping away. As soon as he had done so, however, he wished he had not, for what he saw was an image that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The nightmare continued on its course, careening toward the beleaguered elves. Rowan, heavily engaged in the fighting all around her, did not even see the impending doom until Strahd's blade was already flashing through the air. Henry heard a thwack, and the vampire kept on riding. For one sickening moment, Rowan's dumbstruck eyes locked with Henry's. Then her head tumbled cleanly from her shoulders, and her body collapsed in the grass. "No!" Henry screamed. Strahd reached the far side of the stone circle before reining in his steed, and looking back at the slain elf. "Oops," he said, as he spun his sword. "I expected more from a mage of her skill." Henry looked from Strahd to Rowan's corpse, to Navara. He could not heal the dead, but he could still save one of his friends, or die trying. While tribal warriors closed in again, Henry screamed the wild, guttural scream of a man gone mad with grief and rage. He beat his angelic wings, scattering the attackers. Just as Strahd was beginning to spur the nightmare for another charge, Henry grabbed Navara and lifted her off into the air. They rose straight up, every flap of his wings taking them farther from the howling wolves and whooping druids below. In a few moments they would be clear of Yester Hill. But then Henry heard a sound behind them that made his heart stop. The unholy braying of an infernal beast. He looked back to see Strahd riding his nightmare into the sky. The stallion was galloping through the air as though running on the wind. Strahd called out to him. "Where is Irina, Henry? What have you done with my bride?" Henry cursed and beat his wings harder, but the nightmare was gaining fast. "You thought to play me, Henry? You are a fool!" Navara reached over Henry's shoulder and blasted at Strahd. Her aim was true, but the green bolt merely glanced off his face, leaving not even a scratch. She fired off spell after spell, but no harm befell the vampire. "It's not working," Navara said. "Henry, circle above him. I've got a vial of holy water to dump on his head." Henry did his best to fly directly over the vampire, but when the vial was thrown and splashed onto Strahd's face, there was not a burn or mark to be seen. "What the fuck?" Henry said. Then Strahd extended his fingers toward the fleeing Azamar and boomed out an incantation. Searing pain racked Henry's body. Necrotic magic crawled down his arms and up his neck, and he felt as though he was being burned alive from the inside out. His veins were turning black, and he could taste the smell of rotting flesh coming up from within his own lungs. "Use your magic!" Navara screamed. "Heal yourself!" Henry already was healing himself, but his magic was not nearly strong enough to break the grip of Strahd's spell. His lips could barely form prayers. His wings could barely keep him aloft. His mind could barely maintain consciousness, as pain took him to the brink of delirium. Whatever strength was within him was almost gone. But he could not give up. He had already failed Rowan, and he could not fail Navara. The nightmare was nearly upon them, yet still Henry pressed on, refusing to let go of hope. Then he felt a soft hand touch his cheek. Henry looked down at Navara, cradled in his arms, and when he saw the resignation in her eyes, his heart sank. Tears welled up, threatening to spill down his face. He tried to hold her more tightly, but he knew it was not enough to save her. "Fly, Henry," Navara said. "Fly as fast as you can, and don't look back." Then she vanished, teleporting herself to the back of Strahd's mount. Henry did look back. Strahd's murderous demeanor had changed to one of pleasant surprise. The Count glanced at the beautiful woman now sitting behind him, and took Navara's hand in his. Then he spurred his steed, and they shot across the sky like a comet. "Navara!" Henry screamed. But the flaming horse and its riders had already disappeared into the clouds.